I served 5 years active and another 11 in the reserves. Now I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina, and unfortunately, call sign Extortion 17 is not a work of fiction, but SEAL Team 6 is the colloquial name used for the United States Navy Developmental Warfare Group, which is in Little Creek, Virginia. It is one of several SEAL teams, but SEAL Team 6 is considered to be the elite of the elite. There are several squadrons that operate within SEAL Team 6, and the teams operate in unconventional warfare. They are the very finest of our special operations units and are typically called upon when the United States needs to perform military feats that call for extraordinary achievement. Extortion 17 is the call sign for a United States Army National Guard helicopter, a Chinook CH-47D, which is essentially a troop chopper. The Chinooks have been around for a long time, since the Vietnam era. If you've ever seen one flying, they're large choppers, and you can put about 30 personnel on board, a little over that, and there is a forward propeller and a backward aft propeller. The propellers, if you looked at them from above, they're three blades. They almost look like a peace sign, each one of the propellers. This particular mission originated in northeastern Afghanistan in Logar province, which is about 50 to 60 miles south of the capital of Kabul and bordering the Pakistani border. August the 6th, 2011 was 66 years to the date, interestingly, of the anniversary of our dropping an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, and approximately 97 days after U.S. Navy SEALs had gone into Pakistan and taken out Osama bin Laden. So in the northeastern sector of Afghanistan, there had been firefights going off and on, where we were doing a lot of the same actions that we've been taking in Vietnam. We go in and take an area and then leave it and have to go in and re-secure it because the local Afghan forces weren't able to hold it. Such was the case in this Tangi Valley. There had been a firefight going on in this Tangi River Valley in northeastern Afghanistan for several hours, and United States forces were ostensibly looking for a Taliban operative named Qari Tahir. Approximately 3 hours before this last fateful flight of Extortion 17, which was the greatest loss of American life in the Afghan War, we lost 30 Americans, primarily U.S. Navy SEALs, but not just Navy SEALs. There were also 5 members of the Army National Guard flight crew and 3 U.S. Air Force Special Operations operators. Prior to that, there had been another mission flown by this helicopter and by a sister helicopter, codenamed Extortion 16, in which both of those helicopters lifted off from this forward operating base and took a group of U.S. Army Rangers to an area not far from where this fateful shoot-down would take place, but not over the same type of hot zone. So 3 hours earlier, the helicopter had flown one mission. Then at 2:22 a.m. local time, the chopper takes off, and there are 30 Americans on board and 8 Afghans. Most of those Americans are U.S. Navy SEALs, 17 from SEAL Team 6. There are 5 additional U.S. Navy support personnel supporting the SEAL team. In addition to that, there are 3 United States Air Force Special Operators, these are pararescue operators, and 5 United States Army National Guard flight crew, including 2 pilots and 3 support personnel on the back. In addition to that, there are 8 Afghans on board the chopper. This was supposed to be a 10-minute flight from wheels up to wheels down. Chopper takes off, heads sort of in a northwesterly direction, flying parallel to a mountain ridge. And if you can imagine a fish hook, the flight pattern from the sky resembled a fish hook, with the operating base being at the eye of the hook where you would string the hook. It comes in a parallel pattern to this ridge and then begins to turn back in like a fishing hook would. And then at the spear of the hook, it comes over this hotly contested valley, this Tangi Valley. Now, to set the stage, on May 11th, not quite 90 days earlier, U.S. military intelligence had intercepted message traffic that the Taliban was moving 100 additional fighters into this Tangi Valley with RPGs solely for the purpose of shooting down a United States helicopter with special operators on board. And the acronym is rocket-propelled grenade. They don't have a lot of range, so if you're going to take out a chopper with an RPG, it is by necessity going to be a close-range shot. They're not extremely accurate. Matter of fact, this particular RPG, the RPG-7, according to the military's own report, and I've examined over 1,200 pages of a military report which had been classified and then strangely declassified, and that's another story in and of itself. The RPG has a maximum range of 170 meters, and that's it. But at any rate, this chopper turns in over this valley, and we have intercepted on May the 11th message traffic that they're bringing in 100 extra fighters with RPGs solely for the purpose of shooting down a chopper. The 90-day period between May the 1st, we took out Osama bin Laden, and the last mission of Extortion 17, both involving members of SEAL Team 6, but not with an overlap. We don't believe there are any operators on board the Extortion 17 that went on the Bin Laden raid, but they're part of the same team. There were 3 separate attacks against United States military helicopters over this small valley, so we knew that it was a hot zone. Now, part of the problem here is the rules of engagement under which this helicopter was expected to operate were absolutely suicidal. We're in a situation where when the chopper takes off, it has its sister chopper with Extortion 16. Now, when both of these choppers flew a mission 3 hours earlier, both of them had Rangers on board. In other words, the Ranger team was split half between Extortion 16 and half between Extortion 17. But in contrast, on this particular mission, for reasons unbeknownst to anyone, all the SEALs were jammed into Extortion 17, and Extortion 16, which was in the air and available to transport troops, was empty, except for the flight crew. 7 unidentified Afghans who we think were Afghan commandos. We don't know who they were because of a security breach, and then the 8th was an Afghan interpreter. The other 30 were Americans. There are a total of 5 aircraft converging on this landing zone looking for this one guy. The 2 Extortion 16 and 17, 16 breaks off. Extortion 17 goes in over this valley, accompanied first off by 2 Apache helicopters. They got Hellfire missiles, 70 rocket pods, machine guns, and then flying over that, there was an AC-130 gunship. The gunship was flying counterclockwise. The 2 Apaches in the gunship had their eyes set on the landing zone that Extortion 17 is headed towards. This AC-130 gunship is seeing everything that's happening on the ground, and it sees Taliban. They call them squirters. That's the military acronym that's used in the air traffic control transcript, moving towards the landing zone. The AC-130 repeatedly requests permission to take out these Taliban moving toward the landing zone by foot, and inexplicably is denied permission to take these hostile forces out. And it's unbelievable, absolutely unbelievable. And part of the issue, of course, we know that the summer of 2011 was open season on U.S. choppers in Afghanistan. We already have had 3 choppers attacked. None shot down yet in this valley within the last 90 days before this chopper moves in. And we have on-the-record information and off-the-record information. On the record, the aircraft commander is testifying as part of the follow-up investigation. He gratuitously adds to put on the record that we requested permission to fire on these squirters, he called them, and were denied. The navigator on the AC-130 also testified. Same thing. We were told we could not fire on them, only to try to monitor their position. And we know that as Extortion 17 was almost 8 minutes overdue, still hanging in the air, inexplicable delays hanging in the air, it was taken out at close range by an RPG. It's been a basic tenet of United States military doctrine, even going back to Gettysburg or Iwo Jima, Normandy. We softened the beachhead before we put our troops in. In this case, the landing zone was not blasted, the valley was not cleared out, and as a result, these guys got shot down, and there's no viable explanation for it at all. After the shoot-down, as soon as the Apache helicopters, who, by the way, could have blasted the landing zone also, were not given permission, as soon as the shoot-down occurred, one of the Apaches instinctively began firing into the landing zone. And the commander of that chopper was later raked over the coals as part of the investigation for firing into that landing zone and into the area around the landing zone without permission. After this chopper went down at approximately 2:39 a.m., 12 seconds shy of 2:40 local time, there are contradictory reports as to what group arrived on the ground first. The official military report states that U.S. Army Rangers arrived first at 4:12 a.m. There was clearly units on the ground before that. That's kept out of the military report. That's another story. U.S. Army Pathfinders arrived minutes later at 4:15 a.m. by helicopter. The Pathfinders were flown in on a Black Hawk, and that Black Hawk got pre-suppression fire into their landing zone, as well they should have. But the rules of engagement changed within a matter of less than 2 hours, whereas the Black Hawk team got pre-suppression fire and the SEALs did not, so it's totally inexplicable. We've had choppers fired at over that valley. One was hit, an MH-47, about 3 weeks earlier, and made it back to base. We had another identical chopper on June the 6th, another CH-47D. They fired 14 RPGs and small arms fire at that, but fortunately that chopper was at an altitude that there was a miss. On June the 4th, there was an attack against a Black Hawk in which the RPG exploded within one rotor's length of that chopper and almost brought it down. Despite all that, we still are not giving pre-suppression fire to the SEAL team moving in, and it's absolutely inexcusable. The largest loss of life in the Afghan war for American forces, the single largest loss of life in the history of the U.S. U.S. Navy SEALs. And unfortunately, most Americans don't have a clue about it. There needs to be a national discussion on the rules of engagement, and this case needs to be at the very center of it, because you cannot send your forces in to a hostile zone, especially a hostile zone like Afghanistan, with one hand tied behind their back. They're going to get killed. And this particular helicopter, this CH-47D, being a troop chopper, is not an offensive chopper. It has a .240 caliber machine gun, which is very defensive in nature, but it can't stand the snowbird's chance against rockets fired against it, against RPGs fired against it. And if you don't clear those landing zones, anybody can take a point-blank shot and bring it down. There was very little attention paid to it to begin with. Certainly there was some national coverage, but part of the issue here is there was an investigation ordered the day following the shoot-down on August the 7th by General James Mattis, who at that time was Marine Corps 4-star general officer overseeing CENTCOM there at MacDill Air Base. He ordered a 1-star Brigadier General Jeffrey Colt, to go to Afghanistan and initiate an investigation. This investigation lasted 5 weeks, from August the 7th, the day after the shoot-down, until September 13th of 2011. At the conclusion of the investigation, there was an executive summary indicating no one was at fault. It was just one of those things that happened in the fog of war. So there was an investigation which basically did not address the rules of engagement, nor the fact that the AC-130 had seen Taliban moving. All that was left out of the official report. And one of the strange turn of events in this case is 1 month after the investigation was closed, in September 13th, 2011, in October 2011, the military brought family members of the guys that lost their lives on board this chopper for a briefing at Little Creek, Virginia, which is where SEAL Team 6, or the Dev Group, is headquartered. And during the course of that briefing, someone had taken 1,250 pages of information concerning testimony, exhibits examined, forensics, all this evidence which 1 month earlier had been classified as top secret, somehow was declassified and given to some of these family members on a flash drive. I suspect senior enlisted and mid-level officers, to be honest with you. Somebody wanted this information out. And so one of the reasons that you haven't had much more attention on it, and I'm grateful that the family members got this disc, but there was a delay in getting it to them, and everything sort of died down and other things were happening. But some of the family members began to look at the disc and discovered some serious irregularities, and now we know that there's no reason these guys should have died, none whatsoever. On August 9, 2011, the 30 bodies of the Americans, along with 8 Afghans, were flown to Dover Air Base. I raised the question, why are you bringing Afghans back to the United States? But all 38 were flown to Dover Air Base. On that day, the Pentagon, through its spokesman at the time, Marine Lieutenant Colonel David Lapin, announced that due to the nature of the shoot-down, and here were his words, there are no identifiable remains. In addition, some of the family members are told that their sons are being cremated, which caused a bit of a brouhaha in and of itself. This flash drive was given to family members 2 months after the Pentagon makes the claim no identifiable remains. There was testimony taken from U.S. Army pathfinders on the scene. And the testimony given by the J3 officer indicates at least 8 of the men were found outside the chopper. They were not even hardly burned, and they were clearly identifiable. So we have an irreconcilable conflict between what the Pentagon told us August night and what we know from what the pathfinders found on the scene. We have at least 8 bodies that were clearly identifiable. We don't know if the bodies were cremated or not. I've got some evidence that some possibly were not, but we don't know. In July of 2013, Congressman Jacob Chaffetz of Utah, who would later conduct a nominal hearing in February of 2014, made the comment to Bob Cusack, who was a writer for the publication The Hill in Washington, D.C. He said, the body I saw did not need to be cremated. That comment was made in July 2013 by the congressman whose committee was investigating this, implying that bodies had been cremated. He didn't actually come out and say it, but the military has never said what happened to the bodies. Part of the issue with cremation is if you cremate, you destroy DNA evidence. You don't know who's who. And one of the big questions here, why do we have 7 unidentified Afghans on board that chopper? So it remains a big mystery today. There was a hearing February 27, 2014, conducted by Congressman Jacob Chaffetz's Subcommittee on National Security, part of the House Oversight Committee. At that hearing, which lasted a little bit over an hour and a half, the military presented 5 witnesses. And we've seen these congressional hearings. They all swear to tell the truth. They all sit on the other side of the table. They get asked questions by congressmen. Those 5 witnesses, 2 were civilians. One was an administration appointee working in the Pentagon named Gary Reed, a deputy secretary of defense and low-intensity conflict. He's got a lot of stuff in his title. The second civilian testifying was a lady who was in charge of Pentagon mortuary affairs, funeral expert. The only 3 military personnel were the the officers in charge of the Navy, Army, and Air Force Mortuary Affairs Division. So at the hearing, we have 5 witnesses, 1 who's a political appointee, and 4 who are funeral experts. There is not a single witness from Afghanistan who saw anything, not a single witness concerning rules of engagement, no discussion on that, and there's not a single question from a Congress member of that committee as to what happened to the bodies after there had been an issue on the status of the bodies. That's an issue that needs to be addressed, and it hasn't been, and we don't know what happened. At this point, it appears to have been swept under the carpet. In my opinion, the Standing Armed Services Committee of the House or the Senate should reopen the investigation and have some very open and frank public discussions on the rules of engagement. There needs to be some answers given as to why we aren't giving pre-suppression fire into that landing zone. There needs to be some answers as to why the rules of engagement were set so that the AC-130 could not take out Taliban moving toward the landing zone. I've looked at the internal report, and there was a claim made by Mr. Reed, for example, at the hearing, that the RPG that took this chopper out was fired from a Qualit hut some 220 meters away. First off, there's a Joint Combat Assessment Team which worked under the jurisdiction of General Colt to reassemble everything, to interview everybody. They were the principal on-ground investigators, and this Joint Combat Assessment Team in the military evidence said that no one could identify the point of origin of the RPG, that no one saw it. Yet Mr. Reed said in his hearing that it was fired from a Qualit hut 220 meters away. But this RPG-7 only has a maximum effective range of 170 meters. But see, if you claim that it was fired from a Qualit hut, then you're essentially saying it was fired outside of the landing zone, and you're saying it would have done no good to have cleared the landing zone. Basically, because this chopper was between 100 and 150 feet off the deck, and that's what the JCAT investigation, Joint Combat Assessment Team, concludes when it was shot down. We know the angle of strike, and when you know the altitude and the angle of strike, all you got to do is apply a little basic mathematics, and you can determine the approximate distance that the RPG was from the chopper, and it was at point-blank range in the landing zone. Obviously, in that valley, it should have been cleared out. One thing that is absolutely uncontroverted is the refusal by the chain of command to allow that AC-130 to take out these Taliban operatives. Absolutely disturbing and infuriating. So the centerpiece of the complaint against the military are the rules of engagement that were set. The reversal of the rules that do not allow us to soften the beachhead. That is inexcusable. A lot of questions that should have been asked by the military investigative team that were not asked, and by the United States Congress that weren't asked. Like, what happened to the black box? Like, what happened to the status of the bodies? We found bullets in some of the bodies, and those bullets were thrown away. No questions were asked. But the one inexcusable, incontrovertible thing to take away is that our military, the very finest special operators we have from SEAL Team 6, are being forced to fly into a hot zone where a battle had been taking place for 3 hours, and we have tons of firepower. And I have been in communication with members of U.S. military who were in that region, in that very valley, on other flights, and who were just very, very frustrated. I had some communication with a gentleman who was on another CH-47 that was shot at a year later over the same valley. Still no change in the rules of engagement. I think the rules were set in a politically correct manner. President Hamid Karzai had been complaining about American Special Operations Forces from 2009 on as we announced that we were going to pull out. Karzai, who at that time was the president of Afghanistan, who we installed in 2001, had begun negotiating with the Taliban. He realized that he had to bring the Taliban into a coalition government if he was going to survive afterwards. And so I believe the rules of engagement were set in part to appease complaints that he was making against Special Operations Forces. Additionally, I have been told by members of the military that the Afghans would, in many cases, falsely claim that our air power was killing civilians, which wasn't true. But at any rate, can you imagine the foolishness if you go back to D-Day, General Eisenhower said, okay, we're not going to shell the French coastline because we want to win the hearts and minds of the French people. That was the excuse that the military gave to family members for not having pre-suppression fire. We want to win the hearts and minds of the Afghani people. It's just absolutely mind-boggling. President Obama said we were going to be out of Afghanistan. We're not out of Afghanistan. In Iraq, there's now a step up in sending some advisors back. We've got the whole situation with ISIS going on the ground, and of course the limited number of advisors that are being sent back in are not going to, in my opinion, have any meaningful effect in deterring the growth of that caliphate. So it's difficult to really get a good feel on where both of these operations are headed. It's difficult to maintain an occupation force for a long period of time in any country, and we have been in Afghanistan 10 years, and the rules began to change to make it less and less favorable for our guys to survive. If you're not going to put troops troops on the ground and give them every chance to survive. You don't need to have them there. And we are seeing a lot of reaction in terms of our policy in that part of the world rather than proactive planning at this point. In Vietnam, we were there for a number of years, from the time President Kennedy put advisors in the early 60s until we finally evacuated the embassy in Saigon in the mid-70s. That was a long time. And you become an occupation force. We do great at going in and conquering, but the rules of engagement that were in place both here and in Vietnam, I've heard Vietnam vets tell me that we have come full circle in terms of our determination to protect troops, because in Vietnam, we would take a hill and then abandon it, and then take it in. It's the same foolish cycle. And a lot of that was going on also in Afghanistan, whereby we would pull our forces out. In fact, this valley is one example of that, and the Afghan military would then be unable to hold it against the Taliban, and you go back in and retake it again. This is a very costly type of planning, and we need to rethink that. Why did you cram 17 SEAL members, 30 Americans on one chopper? I was giving a talk in Bath, North Carolina. After I gave the talk, I was approached by a former U.S. Navy SEAL member of SEAL Team 2, who made an observation and concern. He said, look, they're going after one guy, Kari Tahir, with 17 SEALs. Why do you pack everybody on one? But the SEAL was telling me we don't need more than 7 men chasing one guy. This force was deemed an immediate reactionary force. The Ranger team that went in earlier was an assault force. An immediate reactionary force is an emergency force. It is called on in an emergency. So if the Rangers had been pinned down, the SEALs would have been called in to help them out of it. But to use an immediate reactionary force to look for one guy defies the purpose of the immediate reactionary force. In other words, these SEALs were on emergency status. This one guy, Kari Tahir, was eventually killed by a missile fired by an F-16. And one of the questions that had been asked, why didn't you just take him out with a drone to begin with? We really don't know in the chain of command decided to order the SEALs crammed onto one chopper rather than 2. We don't know. And that's one of the reasons I think it's important for the Armed Services Committee to look into this to find out who and why that happened. Remember, there were 2 choppers headed to this landing zone. One was empty. Extortion 16 was empty. And somebody said, well, maybe Extortion 16 was a decoy. Well, it broke off and flew in a holding pattern over a ridge at least 4 miles away when it did this fishhook turn and came into this valley. So it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever to have 2 choppers in the air. You could have split the SEAL team in half, and at least maybe half the guys would survive. At any rate, on the issue of the black box, this is one of the principal mysteries. We know from the military investigation, there's sworn testimony from U.S. Army pathfinders. Remember, they arrived at 4:15 a.m., and those pathfinders, about 20, come onto the ground, and they are ordered to go find the black box. And they spend nearly 2 days looking for the black box and cannot find it. And the sworn testimony of the Pathfinder commander, who testifies under oath, and I've got the exhibit, but attached report, states that this is the first time we were never able to find a black box in any of these choppers that have gone down. At the time of this shoot down, there were 26 or so United States choppers that we lost in Afghanistan over 10 years. Half those were CH-47Ds, just like this one. And the Pathfinder says, it's the first time we've never been able to find a black box. So the families are told in October that it was washed away by a flood. Well, it's true that there was a flash flood into this valley. The chopper went down near a creek. And when you look at photographs of the area, it's sort of very, very muddy. And that night, there were some flash floods, but the ludicrous notion that you're going to lose a black box in a flood when they have pinging low-emission signals anyway, we pull black boxes out of 3,000 feet of water. So that's just crazy to begin with. This whole it was washed away by a flood theory or story lasted for a period of another almost 3 years, from October 2011 until February of 2014, going back to this congressional hearing when this Mr. Reed, Deputy Secretary of Defense, testified to the committee for the first time that the chopper was so old that it had no black box. So we'd gone from ordering pathfinders in to find it, to it washed away in a flood, to 3 now there was never one to begin with, and not a single member of that congressional committee asked Mr. Reed, if there was no black box, then why did we send an Army Pathfinder team looking for one? Not a single question. I have spoken with experienced military pilots, and they think there was no black box story is not credible. I really don't either. The official military report says the first units on the ground were Army Rangers at 4:12 a.m. Those are the same Rangers, by the way, that Extortion 16 and 17 had flown to another site earlier in the evening. They made their way back to the crash site, and then the Pathfinders were there almost immediately after the Rangers. But we have found in the official chronology that there is an unidentified group on the ground at 3:04 a.m. We don't know the identity of the group. The crash site was secured by a Predator drone at 2:55 a.m. I don't know why the final report doesn't mention that unidentified group on the ground. I don't know what they were doing. There is language in this chronology that coalition elements were spotted going into the crash site, examining it, and leaving before the Rangers ever arrived. And remember that the 100 Taliban who were brought in, we discovered evidence of that in May, but the record is not clear. The official military record said the landing zone was ice. In other words, that means nobody was there. But obviously, you got an RPG fired from it, so how's it ice? There have been unofficial speculation on why the SEALs were put on one chopper. We have heard some off-the-record explanations that the SEALs were told that the landing zone was so hot, in other words, it was so full of Taliban that two choppers would have never made it. The second chopper would have gotten shot down. So we don't really know answers to any of those questions, again, underscoring the need for a meaningful investigation. And obviously, the very worst thing that could happen did happen. I don't know whether something happened on board that chopper or not with those Afghans. I don't know. But without a black box, we'll never know. With the voice data recorder, we would have a clue as to what happened. This chopper was delayed in the air, and we lost communication with it at one point. It was supposed to call in. When the chopper took off, there was a pre-arranged protocol for call-in. It was supposed to call in at the 6-minute mark before landing, the 3-minute mark before landing, the 1-minute mark. It made its call at the 6-minute mark. But then when it turned in over this valley, did not make the 3-minute call, did not make the 1-minute call. There were sporadic communications. There were requested what's known as a sparkle. A sparkle is like a flash bulb. When we land these missions at night, we use ultraviolet light, or we use infrared light, which is flashed down by this AC-130. It's called a burn, like a flashlight. And the only way you can see it is with night vision goggles. And the game plan called for a burn 1 minute before landing. Extortion 17, out in the middle of nowhere, when it's not even a minute out, requests a sparkle. And when it requests that, we hear the Apache pilot saying, "Why are you requesting a sparkle? You're not even a minute out." And it's just an odd request from the pilot. The bodies were brought back to Dover Air Base on August 9, 2011. However, the Pentagon made the claim that there were no identifiable remains due to the nature of the shoot-down. The fact is, the Pathfinders found at least 8 bodies outside the chopper that were clearly identifiable and barely even burned. This chopper broke into 3 sections when it went down. I was given access to 3 autopsies. Remember, we lost 30 Americans, so I only had a very small sampling of autopsies. But in 2 of the 3, there's a notation made by the military pathologist which states, quote, "Cook-off rounds found at autopsy but discarded as of having no evidentiary value." Found at autopsy is a phrase that pathologists use, sort of a term of art, means found in the body. A cook-off round is a bullet that goes off because of heat. But you know, the interesting thing about it is, if you were to take a box of .22 ammunition or 30-06, whatever, and put it in a fire, most people think it's going to explode. But if the gunpowder goes off at all, really nothing happens. If the bullet cooks off, the casing of the bullet will travel farther than the bullet itself. The bullet must be inside the barrel of a rifle or a gun for it to cook off and even penetrate the body. In this case, the Pathfinders found the weapon scattered out on the ground. Second oddity about that is, why are you throwing away bullets? Why is the pathologist making an immediate determination there are no evidentiary value and throwing them away? I do not have any evidence to suggest, and I would if I had it, that any of the SEALs on the Bin Laden raid were the same SEALs that were on Extortion 17. There could have been an overlap. We don't know. What I've been told is there are several squadrons with SEAL Team 6, and that Red Squadron was primarily involved in the Bin Laden raid, and these were primarily members of Gold Squadron on Extortion 17. The point is, the Taliban had no way of knowing who was who, except knowing that if it's an American chopper in that valley, it's probably going to be either Rangers or SEALs, because that's all we were flying. We don't really know how many U.S. Navy SEALs were involved in the Bin Laden raid on Neptune Spear. That remains classified, and we may never know. The only hearing that has taken place was a hearing that lasted a little bit more than an hour and a half, involving a subcommittee of the House Oversight Committee, the National Affairs Subcommittee, chaired by Congressman Jason Chaffetz of Utah, and it was pretty much a dog and pony show. No hard questions were asked. The Senate Armed Services Committee, chaired by Senator John McCain, has not looked at it. The House Armed Services Committee has not looked at it, and these armed services committees need to look at it, because what's going to happen, we're going to have another set of Americans get killed based upon the same foolish set of decisions that have been made here. When you look at the whole record, it almost looks like somebody pulled their hands back and said, have at it. The Bin Laden situation and the 90 days up to this shoot-down is crucial, because President Obama comes out late at night, May 1st, approximately 11:30 Eastern, announces that Osama bin Laden has been killed. Now, there had been an agreement brokered by then Secretary of Defense Robert Gates that we're not going to give the name of the group that does this. So President Obama, to his credit, when he comes out, says that the operation is carried out by a small group of Americans. I say to his credit because he doesn't spill the beans on the identity. security. On May 2nd, the Taliban immediately vows revenge. But on May 3rd, the vice president is at a function in Washington, D.C. at a hotel celebrating the 50th anniversary of the North Atlantic Alliance, and as he is speaking, he recognizes a U.S. Navy Admiral, James Stavridis, in the audience. And the vice president gets excited and exuberant, and he says, "There's Admiral Stavridis. So it's amazing what his Navy SEALs did just 2 days ago." So the SEALs are now identified as the unit that's taking out bin Laden. And when that happened, members of the Navy SEALs are calling their family members back home saying, "Get off social media. You now have a target on your backs," and it was very disconcerting. Secretary Gates was extremely upset about it. I don't know why the vice president did that, but he slipped. Not only that, but then on June 24th, former CIA director Leon Panetta slips again in Washington at a meeting and actually reveals that SEAL Team 6 is the unit specifically involved. And when he does that, there are two producers from the movie Zero Dark 30 in the audience. And the Pentagon Inspector General did find that there had been a major breach of security. So you have, unfortunately, a couple of best-case scenarios slip-ups by high administration officials in which the SEAL team is outed. With those security breaches, whether they're intentional or non-intentional, I'm not saying one way or the other, plus the Taliban's vow of revenge going back to the bin Laden raid, plus the fact that we have intelligence intercepting messages they're bringing in 100 Taliban fighters to shoot down an American chopper, plus 3 attacks against choppers in this valley in a 90-day period, and we still don't give this SEAL team on this Army National Guard chopper pre-suppression fire into that landing zone. It just makes your blood boil. There are a handful who want this thing investigated again. There are some who don't want to deal with it. I understand that. It's a painful thing to have to go through. I don't think, from what I've seen, there's any consensus among the family members. Some don't want to deal with it, and that's understandable. Some believe what the military said. Others are demanding another investigation. But we're having our very finest getting killed because of politically correct rules of engagement. And it is not just this administration. It's been a problem going back to the Vietnam War. But the issue isn't, the debate is whether we do or don't need to be there. We are there. And if you're going to put Americans there, you can't get political with the rules of engagement. The rules that get Americans killed are politically driven from the top down to accommodate typically someone else in another country. But if you're going to put Americans in, you have to protect American life first and foremost. And that's not happening. When you're saying we're going to let you shoot at our troops and you can't even clear the area first, of course, it does look like the SEAL team was sacrificed. I'm not saying they have, but it looks like it. I mean, it's absolutely crazy.
Well, Michael was just honored. Him and Jarrett Day just received the National Intelligence Medal of Valor. There's only 19 ever been given out, and I wasn't invited to the ceremony because I'm asking questions. Also, about 4 months after it happened, we were at the NSA there, and it's 5 floors underground and all that secret stuff. So I come out of there, and they knew I was asking questions just a little bit, but I didn't have my paperwork yet. I knew something was wrong, and Rob Cadero, he's a pretty high rank in the Navy, came up to me, and he showed me his phone, and he says, "Mr. Strange, you see this phone? I can hear everything you say, every text message you get, and then you can walk up to me, and I touch this button, and it disappears. We're watching you." And then I got different things like, "You better knock it off, you better stop this." My phone's tapped. My computer goes blue screen. My computer goes off. So I've been warned. They said, "We've warned you, Mr. Strange." I said, "Well, come on up here to Philadelphia and let me see you warn me, because we shoot back up here." My son joined the Navy. He was a senior in high school. I said, "You're not doing this service. There's a war going on." He turned 18. He said, "Dad, I joined the Navy." I said, "Congratulations, son. You got a little goal for yourself. Do your little bit, 4 years." And then once Michael got in there with the cryptology, he finished first in his class in Pensacola. He had a gift. They knew it. They put him in Hawaii with SEAL Team 2. The SEALs used to come pick him up. They wanted him to join. He was under the things with McCraven and all that. I spent 15 days with my son in Hawaii. It opened my eyes. I was like, oh, man. And he never wanted me to worry. And then when they put him with 6 and he had to buy that house in Virginia, I was like, oh, what's going on here? No, Dad, it's all right. I could tell, though, when he would come home, certain things were happening. Like they say, that brotherhood and the friends, I mean, they all live in each other. They know each other's wives, kids. I think it sort of sucks them in. That's like these guys that do 6 years, do 3 tours. They come out, there's no jobs. They go back in. Michael was a CTR1, cryptologist, Tier 1 with SEAL Team 6 Gold for 4 years. He was a team leader. He could do things with the cryptology, with buildings in Iraq, Afghanistan, Bahrain, to find out where Al-Qaeda and Taliban were sending missions to try to kill our guys in a matter of minutes. It was the fastest they've ever seen in naval special warfare. They just gave him another medal, National Medal of Valor for Intelligence, the James Clapper Memo, only 19 ever been given out in the history of America.
He was very humble. He was my oldest son. He was a team guy. He loved our country. He loved his family, and always stuck up for the underdogs. His intelligence, we knew Michael was smart. We didn't know he was that smart. And they did train him, and he did pick up techniques. There was a guy in Michael's class when he first got in. The guy had 4 years of college. He said, Michael beat me in a math test. The guy said, what college did you go to? He goes, I didn't go to college because I worked in a bar. He said, it was amazing. Trigonometry in like 2 weeks of just going over basics and other things from satellites. So I've been hearing a lot from guys from the teams and the guys from Dev Group and the contractors that were over there. I just heard from a contractor 2 days ago who's going to come give me a visit. Quite a few of the guys from Dev Group been stopping by here and there, and they said, a lot of their friends are getting killed, and that's why a lot of them are getting out. It was the biggest loss of life in the history of America, 22 guys from Dev Group. We had a hearing with Gary Reed, who's Chuck Hagel's right-hand man, the congressman from Utah, Jason Tevis. And I got 26 of the parents to write in questions, and 2 weeks before they said, parents can ask questions except for you, Mr. Strange. Our lawyer, Larry Klayman, went ballistic. He said, you got to be kidding me. This is a disgrace. He's the one that started all this. And a week later, they said, none of the parents can ask questions. So Congress asked the questions to Gary Reed, and they sent 4 other people from the military, and none of the people were there when my son got killed. Like, some of them just got hired. They didn't have a clue. They knew nothing. I was very disappointed with Congress. The only one that went to bat for us was the guy from Florida, Micah. He read the questions. The other ones didn't even read the parents' questions that got sent in. We've been back down in Washington, and we won the first case in the history of America against the NSA with Judge Leon. Obama brought 17 lawyers there. We just had another court case 6-7 months ago with 3 superior judges, and the NSA and Obama brought about 20 lawyers that time, and Larry stood his ground, and we have some proof that they went into my phone and in my computer and some threats, and the 3 judges have not given us a verdict back yet on that. We also been to the Pentagon, but I wasn't allowed to bring Larry or any of the other parents. And I give Gary Reed and 2 other chuckleheads each about 15 questions. One question was a half hour after they killed my son. The Taliban was bragging, we just killed SEAL Team 6 on the internet. So Gary Reed says, you can't believe everything you read off the internet. I said, sir, I have the 1,300 pages. And he keeps talking. I said, excuse me. And he keeps talking over me. I said, sir, excuse me. And he keeps talking. So I stand up. And I said, here's Exhibit 89. I said, it's in the paperwork. And they all look at it, and they come up with some other story, and then some security guards asked me to take a walk and drink of water. And I came back, and we said about the Taliban knowing. May 11th, 100 Taliban are coming from the blank Providence to the Tanjin Valley where my son got killed to shoot down the coalition force. They knew. No, what? I said, here you go, sir. It's Exhibit 63. I said, did you read the papers? He said, we only got 8 pages. I said, I got 1,354. Why don't you have the whole report? But I know now why they don't have the whole report. Why would you send somebody that knew that it was a setup, that knew that there was at least dereliction of duty? The biggest loss of life? Our number 1 team, our defense, SEAL Team 6. It was from 1960, refurbished in 1989. Chinook helicopter. I had Navy SEALs just got out 2010, 2011. Drago, a couple other guys stopped by to check on me. And 20 years, 18 years, 14 years, these guys were Navy SEAls. Guess how many times they were in a Chinook helicopter? None. Never. And they'll go to court in Dover when the 30 bodies were coming in, and they had the parents in this hangar, and Obama came up to me, and he put his hands on my shoulders, and he said, Michael changed the way America lives. You have to be, and I grabbed Obama by the shoulders, and I started shaking him. I said, I don't need to know about my son. I need to know what happened. And the Secret Service guys grabbed me and pulled me off him, and I was doubled over, and I was crying, and Obama walked up again, and I whispered in his ear, I said, congressional inquiry. And Obama whispered in my ear, Mr. Strange, we're going to look into this very, very, very deep. That was August 18th, 2011. It took about 12 days for him to get home. But after that, Leon Panetta came up to me and says, Mr. Strange, I'm going to ask the same questions. I said, you're the Secretary of Defense. You're going to ask the same questions. You should know the questions already. And then a couple of the other dads started saying something, and then they walked me outside. They said, well, come on outside, Mr. Strange. Leon Panetta, I'd like to talk to him, too. I just got a phone call about 3 days ago from a guy about Michael meeting with Leon Panetta and this guy. Unless I meet the person in person and I have Larry do a background check on him. But this guy sounded pretty on point with some of the things he was saying. And of course, Don Brown, Navy JAG for 30 years, he just just wrote the book Extortion 17, the shoot down of SEAL Team 6. I talked to Don. He said there's no way an RPG can even go 200 yards to take down that Chinook. He had experts, and these guys been doing this for 20, 25 years with different missiles and man-pads. He said there was a close range, and who else was on the helicopter? We still don't know the names of the Afghans that got killed with my son, and they brought them back to our country. Because when we were in Dover, all of a sudden the Afghan flag came out over a coffin, and my 25-year-old daughter said, "What is that?" I said, "That's an Afghan flag." And she goes, "What the F are they doing here? What are they doing here?" And we got escorted out of there for a little while, too. And the NSA tapping in the phones for me asking questions and harassing me and my wife. About 6 weeks ago, I pull out of my driveway. There's a white pickup truck with New Jersey tags. I live close to the highway, 95 here in Philadelphia. I get off the next exit and down in the neighborhood to go see a buddy. I'm like, he's probably just, I had to think on it. 2 days later, I pull out. I got my wife and my friend in the car, and there's the white pickup truck with the Jersey tags, guy with a beard and a baseball hat on. I said, no way. I said, I think this guy's following us. So I get off the exit. He gets off the exit. I shoot back up on the 95. He's right behind me. I pull over, and he flies by. I'm like, you got to be kidding me, man. You got to be kidding me. And the same with the phone clicking and my computer. I just want to know what happened to my son. It's bad enough they cremated my son. My son didn't need to be cremated. I got pictures of my son. They said 38 skulls, 38 C-spines. It was in the papers. It was in the newspapers from the Pentagon, the Post in Washington. And then I got a picture of my son from a whistleblower down in Dover. You could see the hair on his arms, guys. The only thing bad about Michael was his ankle, and he had a gun in his hand. That's my nightmare. My son's laying there with a gun in his hand, fighting for his life. After whatever happened in Pakistan, May 1st with the Bin Laden thing, Michael came home in June, and he talked about a will for the first time, and 3 times he grabbed me by a bicep. And then when he grabbed me and he said, you wouldn't believe what's going on in this country. The next thing you know, it's something I was thinking about today, and me and my wife were talking, and they went in my son's house the day he got killed and took all his stuff out of his house. They took all his computers. He had his girlfriend there, and like 6 guys came over. They took everything out. Like one of his buddies said, Michael knew what only 4 or 5 people in the world know, Mr. Strange, and I can't get in touch with that kid no more, God bless him. And what did he know? It wasn't Bin Laden? If it wasn't Bin Laden, why wouldn't they just say they shot Bin Mohammed, who looks just like him and is just as evil? Or was it all for political reasons? I mean, Obama went from 46 to 63 in the ratings after they killed Bin Laden. Just like Judge Leon said when we won the case, we're living in an Orwellian state. They can watch it through your computer, the telephone. They took my wife's picture on the computer. We don't have a webcam. Now, that was on all the television stations here in Philadelphia. She was going to Google something. All of a sudden, she starts screaming. I come running out. I said, what's up? I said, I had to get your picture on there. It was taken just right then. And the camera guys came out. The guy goes, do you mind if I look at your computer, Mr. Strange? I said, no. He said, I'm pretty good. I said, go ahead. He was there for like 20 minutes. He said, you don't have a camcorder. Nobody answers. You talk about invasion of privacy. You might as well be living in a communist country. I think Obama's part of the mix. Bush was in there. He changed the rules of engagement twice. Obama changed them 4 times. Things that he changed in this country, weakening our military. It's devastating. It's sad. He kept it close to the vest. And actually, he left early in June. He was here for the weekend, and he had like another day he could stay. And he went baback down to Virginia. And he stopped at my sister's house before he went. He did things that he never did. I believe that the call came from the White House. 90% of the time, somebody from there made call. And then I also got a couple people that's pretty high up that's out now told me that. It was a tier 1 call. I can't say too much more, but you'll hear about it. Larry just filed against Afghanistan, Iran, a few others. He filed like 8 different motions, and they just got put in about 2 weeks ago. They were on hold for about 9 months. About the Chinook, about the military, about the DOD, and he called me right from Washington, D.C. just a few weeks ago and said if the judge passed him, they couldn't believe it. So telling them it was an emergency, tier 1, that means when all the best get in, but who directed them to get in the Chinook helicopter? Who assisted with telling these guys? I could see maybe they told them, get in the Chinook, we're going to drop, like the Rangers were dropped off that night, but they were dropped off like 6 miles away from the Tangine Valley. They flew Michael right into the Tangine Valley. Right where there was 100 Taliban under the trees. They were on top of the roof, and it was pitch dark. There was 3 buildings there. All the lights were out. And then the drones, the eye in the sky, they told us they all had a glitch in them. Come on. They all went out at the same time.
Yeah.
I wasn't military, sir. You're bitching in my face telling me it's raining and my son's dead? Crazy. I get nuts, man. And for me, my son would have done that again. He would have went in there on a 10-speed. He just didn't know that somebody was setting him up. Something's dirty. Something's wrong with this administration. There's too many unanswered questions. The day my son got killed, David Petraeus, he left 10 days later. There was more changes in August 2011 ever in the history of our military. They all got moved. McRaven, all of them got changed. They can't even give us the paperwork on that. It's classified, they said. Everything Larry goes to, Larry's been down to Washington, D.C. with us anywhere from 22 to 25 times, banging on the doors. And we bring about 8 other parents with us, trying to get answers, just so it don't happen to somebody else's son or daughter. And I talked to men that were in Shadoks from Vietnam, other ones that worked at it. Boeing's right down the street from us in Philadelphia, probably about a half hour away. I camped out there by a grocery store waiting for people and talking to them. And a recording device or a black box is definitely in there. Now, the government, when we went back for the 15th time, we said, oh, well, how about the recording device? Well, there was some recording device. About black box? No, there ain't no black box. About an orange box? The black box is painted orange. When they were in the helicopter and they seen the Taliban on top of a building, the pilot, God bless him, called. How about these guys on top of this roof? And they called the Afghan administration and they told them they were hanging crops. So where's that recording? Everything gets, you got SEAL Team 6 on there. It don't matter who you got on there. It's all getting recorded. I mean, they're recording me here. They're recording us right now. They're listening and tapping. You're going to tell me you're not going to listen over there? So how do we get to that? Is it once Obama gets out of office, then can we? Larry said if the Congress and senators had a little bit of gunads, they would have put in impeachment papers for Obama. Just sign them, even if they don't go through. That's all we needed to bring Obama into court. That's all we needed. They didn't have to win the impeachment or not, just the papers to be signed. Then we had the executive authority to bring him in for trial, and Biden and Panetta. But as him as president, bring Biden in, he's going to give them all pardon. It has to be the president. He's commander-in-chief. The upper echelon of our military is so, they look down at other people, these 4 stars and some of these generals and admirals. It's a disgrace. They're supposed to be working for us. We pay them. And you hear these guys that come home, they get their girlfriend pregnant, and they can't find a job. They feel, and then all the stuff they see over there and what's going on over there, it's like 3 or 4 a day. They're killing themselves. And then in Tennessee, 4 Marines and another guy get killed by a Muslim jihadi. Greg Buckley, Google him. His son called home the night before and said, Dad, none of the Marines in Afghanistan on the base were allowed to have guns, but the Afghan National Army had guns. And the T-boy came up to his son and said, oh, you're leaving in 3 days. And that's when his son called home and said, Dad, man, I don't think I'm going to make it home. And his son was lifting weights. The T-boy came in with an AK-47 and shot his son. And the other kid killed him. They caught the T-boy. You know what they sentenced him to? 7 years for killing 2 Marines because the Afghan judges said he was under 18. He had a full beard. He looked like he was about 30. I just talked to a guy who's training Iraq soldiers 2 weeks ago over there. He said, it's sad. The corruption and the money that's spent and goes through hands, the drugs, the heroin, oh my, you wouldn't believe it. And then I think when my son said, you won't believe what's going on in this country, Dad. And then the next thing you know, he gets killed. I truly think Michael and a couple of them guys, they were like, this ain't right. Were they going to talk? Weren't they going to talk? Was it a big lie with the Bin Laden thing? I bet all the money and all the heroin. Before the war started in Afghanistan, we only got 20% of the heroin. Now it's 96% of the heroin that comes into our country comes from Afghanistan, and they know it. We don't have that many people on morphine. The first time in June 2011, they grabbed me by the arm. He said, Dad, I got a will. I said, what are you talking about? He said, Dad, I'm not effing around. Listen to me. 3 times. And he never mentioned the will in 8 years in the service. And then all of a sudden, he talks about a will. He grabs me about, what's going on with this country? And the way he was, he knew something was going on. And I believe that he did deal with the people from Pennsylvania Avenue on a few things and some of them top admirals and generals. It was by design. There ain't no way they weren't getting killed. That was designed. The whole thing with the Chinook, the Taliban under the trees, on the rooftops, the call, everything. If the Rangers were in trouble, Tier 1, they changed it from the Rangers were in trouble because I said, no, it says here in the paperwork 6 times. It's the guy's statement. The Rangers were in no trouble. Oh, no, they were after Quarry Tahir, a high level. But they were after Quarry Tahir. Quarry Tahir also knew. He moved to another village that night. He knew. Everybody knew. It was designed. They knew in May that they were coming, and it was planned and set up. Like I said, I'm not military, but I could see the triangle they set up. I could see the calls. And And then over the years now, coming up on 4 years, I still look at the pages here and there. I mean, I got it embedded in my head that no matter what, they had backup after backup to kill these guys from what they knew, what Michael and them guys knew that was going on in this country. You know, so you got to go to the head guy, Barack Hussein Obama. He's got to answer. And some of them generals. How do they live with each other? How do they sleep at night? You can't justify that. I mean, you got to answer at the end. How do you do that? You can't.
In October 2011, the families were brought into Little Creek Base, and Brigadier General Jeffrey Colt stood before the families with his staffs and explained to us what took place the night of August 6, 2011, why the SEALs came in, the Rangers part of the mission, the name of the Operation Lefty Grove, the CH-47 chopper that they were flying in because we didn't have enough MH-47s, the men who were not taken out after the chopper was shot down because of the ROE, and the winning the hearts and minds strategy that was taking place in Afghanistan. So we left there that day with absolutely some questions that we wanted answers to, and I'm sure many other parents did too. When we left, everybody was given a folder, a synopsis of what had taken place, took it home, put it away, didn't think about looking at it again until our Congressman, Tom Rooney, was lied to by some high-ranking military official in a classified meeting. He attended to seek answers to two of the questions that I had presented to him. Why were they on a CH-47D, and why were the men who fired the RPGs not taken out? When he was told that they didn't know where the shots came from, I knew that's not what we were told. And my friend Charlie Strange, who had lost his son Michael Strange, had been telling me for a month or two, Billy, you got to take a look at this disc we were given, and I didn't want to do it. But sometime a week or two after I went in, put the disc in, and I was overwhelmed with the information that I began to uncover. There was a man there on General Colt's staff. At that time, Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Grant. He was the man that I asked that question to 2 more times, and he told me the same story each time that General Colt had said. Karen and I had some information that Colt promised to give us that day about our son, and so Colonel Grant contacted me after we got home, so I had his contact information. Before Rooney went, Grant called my house to make sure he was sending that information to the right address. And at that time, there had been some complaints from some of the families that you couldn't read the information in the folder. It looked like the printer was out of ink. And I expressed that to him, and I said, is there any way we can get that information? Lieutenant Colonel Grant said, a few days ago, Mr. Vaughn, I'm sure we could have done that, but some of the higher-ranking military officials, he didn't call any names, have found out that that is out. They've actually asked us to come and retrieve that information back from the families, but it's been our express concern to the high-ranking military officials, if we do that, we're going to lose the family's trust. That was his words, and so nobody ever came after the information.
I'd been a JAG officer on active duty for 5 years and did spend time at the Pentagon. Had been a special assistant U.S. attorney and remained on the reserves for another 14 years. So I know a little bit about how to read military documents and to understand evidence. When I learned about this case, I felt that it was important for somebody to look at the evidence, sort of like a prosecutor would look if there were a grand jury proceeding, just to take a dispassionate examination of what happened. I got in contact with Billy and Karen, and the background is that for some reason, and this is one of many mysteries surrounding this case, there was a report released, had been declassified. Some of it remains classified, which we don't have, but about 1,250 pages, which I refer to as the Colt report, because the investigating officer for this shoot-down was Brigadier General Jeffrey Colt. Now, it's my understanding now he's a Major General, or he was promoted at some point. But at that point, he was a Brigadier General. So that report has about 1,250 pages, many exhibits, and I took a look at that, and the report itself, when I received it, was sort of like a puzzle with 100 scrambled pieces. So part of the issue is taking the evidence out and trying to reconstruct the puzzle and then decipher what the military language is and determine what was done when and why. And I did not really approach this with any type of objective other than trying to establish a historical chronology of what's happened in this case for historical purposes, and then to examine the evidence to see if there's anything we could find out about what went on, what went wrong. First off, I heard it on the news. I did not have the full details, and as information continued to come out, there seemed to be more questions than answers. And of course, there had been, in 2005, up to that point, the most tragic chopper loss in Afghanistan prior to 2011 shoot down. And this was worse. I saw an interview that Karen and Billy had done. I sent them an email, said, do you need some help with this? And then I wound up meeting Karen and Billy. I drove from Charlotte down to Atlanta, met with them, and we talked, and Billy gave me a copy of the disc. I took it back and began to study it. It took a week or two, and as I was going through it and deciphering things, more and more things did not add up, and there were some real red flags. There are even more red flags that appear once you start digging into the report and comparing contradictions than we've seen to date. But whenever you're attacking evidence like this, you have to try to start with the basics first. So the first thing I was trying to focus on is the chronology of what happened to that chopper that night. And even now, that chronology in that flight, which lasted about 17 minutes from takeoff to shoot down or whatever happened to it, is crucial. Then you're looking at what happened at various points of time during that flight, what we know, what we don't know, and then you sort of look at everything else surrounding that to try to put the pieces back together. But there are still parts of this report that are classified and that we don't have. So when you go through and you look at exhibits in it, you'll pull up certain exhibits that have been redacted and that we don't have. So it's difficult to know how much has been declassified. It appears that most of it has, but there's still stuff that's being held back, and I've got some suspicions on what. But anyway, that's where we are. The biggest elephant in the room is that this helicopter was infiltrated by 7 unidentified Afghans who jumped on this chopper before takeoff, violating every sense of military aviation protocol, and that was left out of the final report. And it was not discovered until over a year later, after the investigation was closed, when the gentleman sitting with you happened to find a needle in the haystack and confronted Admiral McCraven about it. The military left that out, and it is a breach of military aviation.
One sentence. On page 118 of Exhibit 1, there's a J3 testifying, and he says something to the effect that everybody on the chopper were the correct names on the manifest except for the 7 Afghans. But immediately after that, the JSOC commander cuts the man off in the testimony, and he says, that's not the big deal. We recovered 38 bodies. They're not mentioned again, and in fact, who is mentioned, now their right names are not given, but their abbreviations are, at the end of the testimony is everybody that was questioned in the investigation. If they're with the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, whoever they're with, and one contractor, I believe. No Afghans are mentioned that they even ask any Afghans any questions. But Karen and I determined in our minds, well, maybe they do this because the Afghans don't give their right names. On the day Extortion 17 was shot down, August 6, 2011, a 3-star Admiral William McCraven received his 4th star on the same day that he met me and my wife at Dover, Delaware Air Force Base to talk to us about our son's body and all the rest of the Americans killed. He still went through his promotion that day after he had lost that many men on August 9th. But 4-star Admiral McCraven was at our house, and I brought up the 7 Afghans, and I said, it must not have been a big deal. It was just mentioned in that one sentence, and it said nothing else about it. Admiral McCraven sat stone-faced, didn't say a word, but he had with him a senior enlisted advisor from Delta. He said, Mr. Vaughn, that's a very big deal. That should never happen.
So the Admiral sits silently, and after a few moments, the Sergeant Major speaks up and says, Mr. Vaughn, this is a very big deal. Yeah. And one of the mysteries is, how does this report get out to begin with? I believe it's probably the senior enlisted and mid-level officers who want the truth out. But this sliver of evidence that Billy found that came out a year and 3 months after the investigation was closed and was not discussed at all in the final findings is found at page 118 of Exhibit 1. There's a question by the Deputy Investigating Officer. Was there a manifest for that aircraft back at and the J3, that's the acronym that we use for Operations Officer, for the Joint Special Operations Task Force, says, yes, sir, there was a manifest, and I'm sure you know by now that the manifest was accurate with the exception, now listen, with the exception of Afghan personnel that were on. So the Afghan personnel, the testimony under oath continues, were the incorrect. All 7 names were incorrect, the J3 says. And then he says, I cannot talk to the backstory of why that happened, but, and when he says but, he's cut off by his boss, the commander of the Special Operations Task Force, who says, but the bottom line is, we know the total number that we were trying to account for on the ground, and that is it. So he shuts up the J3, and not another word is mentioned about this infiltration. U.S. military regulations require strict adherence to the flight manifest. But not only that, DOD regulations 2131 require that we get the name, social security numbers, rank, etc., every person on board a United States military aircraft. And not only that, but by regulation, the commander is required to make certain certifications about weapons that are brought on board. So this was a big major league breakdown. And I believe that the flight was infiltrated, and some American commander had the responsibility for someone on the ground for making sure that the manifest was correct, but that is totally left out. So the fact that the official report basically tries to bury this as a red flag, and these guys are testifying under oath, by the way. The general was given the authority to swear these folks in. Not one Afghan, though, was questioned at all. At least the official report we have, not a single Afghan was questioned, but this testimony is under oath.
On February 27, 2014, there was a hearing held by the Oversight Committee, and Don's going to point out some of the lies told by Deputy Secretary Gary Reed, who works for the Department of Defense for the Obama administration. He was a witness to Congress on February 27th. He was, however, not in the position August 6, 2011 to be what he is called a real witness, along with 4 other people who were called witnesses by the Congress. And he met with my friend Charlie Strange after this, and he told Charlie that, in fact, he never looked at the testimony. He was just debriefed on what happened, so he had no reason to be in the position he was in. And then he sat and lied, and Congress did not ask him any rebuttal questions.
I've been given access to 3 autopsies. I've given the words of the families that I won't reveal the names for privacy reasons. 2 of these autopsies were performed at Dover Air Base when our fallen heroes were brought back. The military pathologist makes a notation at page 3 of those autopsies that there are cook-off rounds found, but they are disposed of as having no evidentiary value, or words to that effect. The language is cook-off rounds found at autopsy, which means in the bodies, but discarded. And to me, that's a big red flag. A cook-off round is basically a bullet that goes off if enough heat is applied. Most folks think if you were to take a box, say, of .22 ammunition and throw it into a fire, that the box of that ammunition would ignite and become dangerous. But the fact of the matter is, this isn't true. If that bullet does go off, it's fairly innocuous. If that bullet does explode with heat, what happens is the casing will actually travel farther than the bullet itself because it's lighter. It is not a threat unless the bullet happens to be in a barrel, and that barrel is aimed at you and then sufficiently heated so that it goes off. This chopper, according to the report, fell between 100 and 150 feet off the deck when it exploded, according to the Colt report. We've examined testimony, and the personal weapons were not found in the chopper. They were scattered outside the chopper. And the other thing that concerns me is why in the world is a military pathologist discarding these bullets and making the judgment that they're of no evidentiary value? You can't really tell if it's a cook-off round just by examining the slug. In most cases, you got to look at the casing, see if that casing has been struck, because when a centerfire bullet is struck by the hammer, there's an indentation in the casing. The casings weren't matched with a bullet, so how do we know it's a cook-off round to begin with? There were 3 U.S. Air Force Special Forces, 17 members of the SEAL team, primarily from SEAL Team 6, and then there were 5 U.S. Navy support personnel who rushed onto this chopper, the CH-47D, an old chopper piloted by a National Guard air crew. Now, the choice of platform was incorrect here. These guys should have been on a Special Forces chopper, an MH-47, maybe a Special Forces Black Hawk, but this is an old, slow chopper that basically has been compared to a flying school bus. It's used for transport, not for special operations. Nevertheless, the chopper takes off at approximately 2:22 a.m. Now remember, this is supposed to be a 10-minute flight to landing and infiltration. They take off from Forward Operating Base Shank in the eastern sector of Afghanistan in Logar province and fly immediately across the border into Wardak province. There is an aviation protocol for call-ins. The chopper is to call in at 6 minutes before landing, at 3 minutes before landing, and at 1 minute before landing. It takes off at 2:22. 4 minutes later at 2:26, we get our 6-minute call. We're looking for a 3-minute call at 2:29 and a 1-minute call at 2:31, and the chopper to be on the ground at 2:32. The first call comes in. The second call, however, there's nothing there. And the third call, the chopper has gone totally blank. It appears to be hanging in the air as it approaches. Now, if you look, there are maps in here, and this flight pattern is akin to what looks like from the air a fishhook. So it takes off with the round part of the fishhook being the operating base, flies in, and then does a turn and comes back into this tangy valley. Now, United States intelligence found out on May the 11th, the Taliban was moving 100 operatives into that valley solely for the purpose of taking out a United States helicopter. And at this time, between Operation Neptune Spear, which is the operation that apparently took out bin Laden, and this operation, 96 days passed, there had been 3 attacks on United States helicopters in that valley. 2 missed, 1 hit. So we knew that it was a dangerous situation. This mission was the second mission that Extortion 17 had flown that night. It had flown a group of Army Rangers, the initial assault force, into the area and landed, but it did not fly over this valley. But it landed on time and debarked a group of U.S. Army Rangers 16 and 17. They were twin choppers flying together, two Chinooks, and they both flew in and put those Rangers down. They put them down on time, no problems, and then flew back and started the flight at 2:22 a.m. into the Wardak Valley to drop these SEALs off. This flight crew involved 5 U.S. National Guardsmen, primarily from Colorado and Kansas. The pilot in command was CW2 Brian Nichols. He was an Army veteran, but this was his first flight into combat, his first deployment as a pilot to Afghanistan. But his co-pilot was the superior officer, CW4 David Carter, out of Denver. Carter had over 20 years flying this bird. He was an experienced pilot, and they put these choppers down on time with these Rangers just a couple of hours earlier. No problems, no sweat. They come in, and all of a sudden, after the 6-minute call, there's a loss of communication with the chopper. Ground control's trying to raise them, nothing's there. They missed the 3-minute call. They missed a 1-minute call. Then after a lapse of 10 minutes, at 2:36, there's a very strange communication from Extortion 17. The pilot, or someone on board, and I believe it was the pilot, is requesting a sparkle. Now, Extortion 17 was being accompanied in the air by an AC-130 gunship overhead and 2 attack Apache helicopters alongside with it flying in. The plan calls for what we call a burn. A burn is like if you were to turn the flashlight on and let it burn for a minute, it would create a beam that you could see. Well, what we do to put these teams down in the evenings and night hours is that AC-130 fires a burn, not a sparkle, but a burn, which is an infrared light down into the landing zone. It's invisible to anyone by the naked eye, but if you have night vision goggles, you can see it. When those choppers went down and put these Rangers down earlier, they used a burn, which lasts about a minute. Well, Brian Nichols asked, rather than a burn, he asked for a sparkle, which is not part of the flight plan. A sparkle is like an old flash bulb. And one of the pilots on board, one of the Apaches in the air with him, he said, "You're not even a damn minute out, and you're asking for a sparkle?" So it is a very strange request. So a relay is made from the Apache helicopter flying with Extortion 17 to the AC-130 above. The 130 begins to burn into the landing zone. Now, we know that Taliban have access to night vision goggles, but it appears rather than delivering a sparkle, the AC-130 did what it was supposed to do and delivered a burn. But we still had not gotten the 1-minute call because the Apache pilot asked the Extortion pilot, "Are you 1 minute?" Negative, not 1 minute. At 2:38 a.m. in the morning, after this odd request for a sparkle, we hear another call from Extortion, and that is 1 minute, 1 minute. And over a minute and almost 2 minutes later, it's still hanging in the air. Still not on final approach, close to the landing zone, and that's when there's this explosion. Apparently, according to the report, 3 RPGs were fired at it from a Qualit hut. Although the testimony from the AC-130 gunship and the testimony from the pilots who were accompanying Extortion on board those Apache choppers, who all were denied pre-suppression fire, by the way, and if pre-suppression fire had taken place, these guys would be alive today. But nevertheless, those in the air who testified, none of them could say that they saw the source of where these RPGs were fired from. But when you start looking at evidence, they say that it was fired from a Russian-made RPG-7. The evidence contained, even within the report, the maximum effective range of that RPG is only 170 meters. I believe they want to make the argument that pre-suppression fire into the landing zone would have been irrelevant because the shot was taken from outside the landing zone. But I'm absolutely convinced that this was a point-blank shot. And by the way, British newspaper accounts indicated that they had learned from a senior Afghan official that the Taliban had been tipped and knew where this chopper was coming down. Not one question is asked in the Colt report about whether the Taliban had been tipped. Not one question was asked from Congressman Chavez's committee. That hearing in February of last year, 2014, was a dog and pony show. There was not one single witness from Afghanistan that appeared before the Congress to ask questions about what happened that night. The 5 witnesses, one of them was a Pentagon official named Gary Reed. The other 4 were funeral experts. We had the principal civilian funeral expert from the Pentagon testify, and then we had the head of Air Force Mortuary Affairs, the head of Army Mortuary Affairs, and the head of Navy Mortuary Affairs to talk about the treatment of the body. There was not one witness who was from Afghanistan who could give any substantive evidence whatsoever about what happened to this chopper. And the Congress needs to relook into this now.
In the report, the pilots say we can almost never get suppressive fire approved. One of the other crews says it's a 1 in a million chance we can get suppressive fire. We don't know for sure why it didn't happen, but we do know that night when the Pathfinders went in to recover the bodies, they got suppressive fire. Mr. Reed points out there was no black box. That was the narrative for the Department of Defense from the time of debriefing all the way up until the hearing, is that it was washed away in the flood.
An unidentified group called Lima Bravo was the first group to come in to this crash site. The crash site was secured actually by a drone Predator only minutes afterwards. There was a drone overboard. But those two facts about the drone and this Lima Bravo group coming into the scene are not included in the final report. However, U.S. Army Pathfinders came in to the area, and we have their sworn testimony, and they were told to go find the black box. And they spent all night and day looking for the black box, came to the conclusion that it had washed down this wadi. So the story was the black box had washed away. I am suspicious that it may have been removed before the Pathfinders got there because of things that were left out. For the final report of General Colt's executive summary, which General Mattis, who was CENTCOM the 4-star, then approves, none of this about having an initial group by ground came in and examined the landing site and left. We found that buried deep within the report. We don't know who they were. They're referred to as Lima Bravo, LB. Now, maybe, again, their identity could be in the classified portions that remain. But we don't know who they are or what they did or why they left. Why are you going to come in to a crash site if you are looking for possible survivors or anything like that and then leave the crash site? Because the report indicates they came in on a road and left on a road, and then when the Pathfinders arrived, another group was there also. But we don't know who that first group was, and it concerns me that we have these inconsistent testimonies in the black box. You know, I have consulted with a friend of mine who will remain unnamed, who's a veteran U.S. Navy pilot, and he tells me that Mr. Reed's claim in February of 2014 that the chopper had no black box, which comes from out of the blue, is totally inconsistent with what we heard before, is not credible. Mr. Reed tries to say because this is an older CH-47, it is an analog chopper rather than a digital chopper. I've been told, and I've researched this even with Boeing, that these choppers is not going to not have a black box simply because it may have been analog. And let me just say this. If we're sending these special forces in on a chopper without a black box, talk about the level of incompetence and insensitivity that involves. So it's a no-win situation for the military to, on the one hand, argue we can't find a black box, and on the other hand, argue it doesn't have a black box.
The Pathfinder commander testified that there have been 27 chopper crashes in Afghanistan. 13 have been CH-47s. This is the first one they did not retrieve the black box off.
That changes this.
That's his testimony.
Yeah. That's why Karen and I keep up the fight. We want to know about the cover-up that happened with Aaron. We want questions answered. But the ROE, the way that they operate, is continuing. There are many special operations and also special forces men and some of their families who have spoken to Karen and I and said, please keep speaking up. You can look at the news. You can hear Air Force pilots saying right now these ROEs are keeping us from doing our job in Syria and Iraq. And so our military continues to be dismantled, demoralized, and not allowed to do what they are capable of doing. And it's hurting the morale in the military. It's also hurting the security of our republic and of our allies.
Sending special operators into harm's way with their arms tied behind their back. Can you imagine if at D-Day, General Eisenhower had said, we're not going to shell the beaches at Normandy because we want to win the hearts and minds of the French people and we're afraid of friendly fire. We're just going to send our guys into German machine gun fire without any softening of the beachhead. That's how foolish this is.
With the information that Karen and I had, I gave it to Don, I gave it to others, but it was also given to Mr. Chaffetz and Mr. Issa in June of 2013. So they had all that information before February 27th. With that hearing going the way it did, in my opinion, Mr. Chaffetz, chairing the committee at the hearing, became part of the cover-up. He became part of the cover-up.
One minor point, we don't know about the condition of the bodies. We don't know what happened. We know there was an issue of cremation, yet there was not a single question asked about what'd you do with the bodies. And we had a hearing with 4 funeral experts. So what isn't that question yet asked? We know that Congressman Chaffetz in July of 2013 had spoken to Bob Cusack and was reported in the Hill. He said the body I saw did not need to be cremated. So the congressman knew about that, obviously. For whatever reason, no meaningful questions were asked. And this was not an investigative committee hearing. It was something else. There are so many inexplicable inconsistencies between the official investigative record, the Colt report, versus what the military has said publicly. Point number 1 is the issue of the mysterious disappearing black box. There is sworn testimony in that report from United States Army Pathfinders. The platoon leader testifying under oath that a group of 20 Pathfinders landed at 4:15 a.m. and were immediately ordered to go find a black box or flight data recorder, which includes a voice data recorder and other instruments. So they spent the whole night looking for the black box, could not find it. Spent the next portion the next day looking for it and could not find it. Finally, they concluded that it must have been washed away by a flood. And so when the family members met with General Colt in October, nobody had changed that position. The military never backed down off that, and that's the most ridiculous thing in the world. There was a little creek or a wadi in this tangy valley. The bigger question is, who are the guys walking around the helicopter beginning around 3:04 a.m. when the official report says that U.S. Army Rangers were the first to secure the scene at 4:12 a.m. We had discovered evidence that there was one unidentified unit on the ground. OS means on site at the Extortion 17 crash at 3:04 a.m. That is left out of the official report. Now, who are they? The point being, this whole "it was washed away by a flood" sort of narrative was never changed or corrected until the day of this hearing, February 27, 2014, in which Mr. Gary Reed, the Assistant Deputy Vice, whatever he is, we've got his title, he's a bureaucrat in the Pentagon, testified for the first time there was no black box.
Obama appointee, 2012.
He's an appointee. So he testified there's no black box. The problem is, not a single member of the Congress said, well, Mr. Reed, you say there's no black box. Then why do we send a United States Army Pathfinder team looking for it for 2 days? That question wasn't asked. He said these choppers don't have black boxes, but there's sworn testimony from that Pathfinder that this is the first time we have never been able to recover a black box. Now, I've spoken with experienced military pilots who simply don't believe it. I don't believe it either. At the time this chopper went down, out of the 27 choppers that had gone down in Afghanistan, half of those were CH-47D Chinooks. The Pathfinder's job is to go and clean up the wreckage. They were looking for the black box. They said it's the first time we've never found one. Reed said because this is an older chopper with analog instruments, it doesn't have a black box. That is not accurate. The black box, if it had a voice data recorder in it, we could have heard what was going on inside that chopper before it was shot down. If it was infiltrated, we would know it. Or if there were some sort of mechanical issues, we would know it. So it's a no-win situation for the government. Even if it were true there weren't a black box, why are you putting an elite SEAL team on a chopper with no black box? But I just have a tough time believing that. My gut is that somebody got in and tampered with it between the shoot down and 4:12 a.m. when the Rangers first arrived. The Rangers walked in by foot because they were several kilometers away. But those Pathfinders came in on a Black Hawk. They could have been there almost immediately. It was a 10-minute flight. Why were the Pathfinders delayed? And the Pathfinders did get pre-suppression fire in their landing zone.
I have spoken to a previous pilot, part of the flight crew of Extortion 17. Let me say this. If it didn't have a black box on it, it disappeared over there. Because when it went on the boat at Savannah, this man and members of his crew say it had the black box on it. In particular, I asked him, are you talking about the black box that records the engine performance? He said, Mr. Vaughn, I'm talking about the black box that is actually orange that sits beside the seat.
Those referring to his conversation with the chief warrant officer.
But I'm going to say this. You don't need to spend any resources if you've got the black box. It's somewhere in the Pentagon.
The crucial issue is the timeline. The executive summary, General Colt says that the standoff on by General Mattis, that the U.S. Army Rangers, the initial assault force, arrived on the scene at 4:12 a.m. local time. That's what's in the report. But you've got to dig in and find that enclosure H, which is the chronology. We know an unidentified unit was on scene at 3:04 a.m. over an hour before that. So the question is who and what were they doing, and why was not that in the final report?
About that title, because it's bothered me ever since they said it. Low intensity conflict. Do you think the men getting out of those choppers at night and going fighting the enemy head on, close combat every night, thought it was low intensity conflict?
If that is his slated explanation, the first question is this: why was that kept out of the final report? That is a major security breach. Second question is, who are the Afghans? What are their names? The third question is, who is the American officer in charge of maintaining the integrity of the manifest? Fourth question is, why do we find bullets in a couple of bodies here? We have limited access to autopsies. And why were those bullets summarily thrown away by the military pathologist at the autopsy with the doctor making a determination they're of no evidentiary value? So who are the Afghans? What are their names? And how did this happen? If you look at the sworn testimony of the J3, page 118 of Exhibit 1, the interrogating officer is tell us about the manifest. The J3, who is the operations guy for the Joint Special Operations Task Force, says, we got all the names right except the Afghans. And he says, but gets cut off. Once there's a heroic unnamed Sergeant Major Delta Force type who spilled the beans on this, and God bless him, and I know he did it because he wants the truth out. So if there's a reasonable explanation for it, and maybe there is, why are you hiding the names? And why are you bringing the Afghan bodies back to the United States? And what did you do with them? Did you cremate them? Did you send them back to Afghanistan? Those are the types of questions that should be put to Mr. Reed.
Before the hearing, just like with the black box, they had 2 years to say these men were mixed up with the Rangers. The Rangers took the SEALs, Afghans, and blah, 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 and all. They had 2 years to say that. Why didn't they go ahead and say that? What was told to me 1 week before the hearing, when I was talking on the phone to Chaffetz's ISIS head guy, when he asked me, what is one of the main questions you want answered? I said, I want to know who the 7 Afghans were. He said, Billy, you're not going to find that out. The military has classified that answer. The next week of the hearing, Reed came out with that they were the Rangers guy. One final comment on that. This is hearsay. General John Allen told Colonel Oliver North, who told a military friend of mine, a 1-star, we'll never know who the 7 Afghans are because Hamid Karzai is out of office now, and there's no way we can ever get that information.
The choice of platform, in this case the CH-47D, was transported these guys in. Had they been flying an MH-47, would they have survived? It's impossible to say. I'm not optimistic that would have happened because it's almost like somebody just pulled their hands away and said, have at it. Take these guys out. If the Taliban knows exactly where any chopper is coming in, and I'm convinced the Taliban was tipped. The British press reported that they knew the landing zone. The op-ed in New York Post from this past Sunday covered the French press reported they knew where they're coming. If you know the exact landing zone, you can wait for any chopper and shoot it down. And so I agree, that's a point of discussion, but I almost think it's almost like the debate on the choice of platform here may have been inserted in the report so that we're arguing about something other than the real issue, right, starting with the rules of engagement, because they should have blasted the living heck out of that landing zone and everything around it, and that would have taken care of the problem.
One of the changes that Colt suggests in his after investigation report is that they changed their method because the valley was already on high alert. There'd been a 3.5-hour operation going on, 2 AH-64s, an AC-130, and tons of gunfire in the area. So the stealthness of the operation had been over some 3.5 hours. Obviously, the SEALs weren't the first one there. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows that the jig was up. In fact, the AC-130 guy uses that. The jig was up. We didn't think it was safe to bring another chopper in. There was no secrecy about this mission. About it that was secret, and for Gary Reed to even hint that the Afghans didn't know that this operation was taking place, it's a bald-faced lie, or he's just totally ignorant about the things that are going on.
But there is no justification for these rules of engagement. It's virtually criminal to subject this team into this hot zone without pre-suppression fire.